Today's objective is to give you a few helpful tips on how to use the tools you have to measure distance, how to set up the perfect cone taper, and how to set up an arrow board properly. You may not have a measuring wheel with you, so we'll teach you how to use a few things that you may have more accurately. We'll teach you how to use the odometer, your stride, and reflective bumps in the road to help determine distances for setting up a work site. The first thing you need to find is the odometer reset button. Once you're at the beginning of where you'd like to start measuring from, hold the reset button down until it zeroes out. Then release the reset button. Never let anything distract you from paying attention to the traffic around you. This technique is helpful for all setups at all speeds, but is particularly helpful when determining where to put early warning signs when they need to be 500 feet apart, because every tenth of a mile is 528 feet. Here's an example of what it would look like if you were to use this technique to measure a complete work site. Use your spacing chart to determine how long your total work site will need to be for the speed of the road. You'll then add up your buffer, taper, and all your early warning sign spacings together. Then you'll need to know where the buffer will end and where the start of the work site will be. Once you've reached where the buffer will end and where the start of the work site will be, reset your odometer and drive away until you've reached the distance that you've added up. If it is safe to do so, you may even want to pull over and set out your end roadwork sign before you turn around to set out your other early warning signs. Stride. What does it mean? The definition is to take a long step. It's very useful, particularly when setting out cones. A stride will vary by person, but it is important to know what yours is. So take a few minutes and measure your stride. Make sure you measure walking forwards and backwards, because your stride while walking backwards will be shorter than your stride walking forwards. Let's take a look at the spacing chart to figure out how far apart the cones will need to be in the taper for a 45-mile-an-hour road. So once you've measured your stride, you can use a spacing chart and a few simple math equations to become more accurate when setting out your cones. My stride is 3 feet, and at 45 miles an hour, the cones and the taper need to be 45 feet apart. So if I take the cone spacing distance, which is 45 feet, and then divide that by my stride, which is 3 feet, it equals 15, which means that I will be dropping a cone every 15 strides as I'm building my taper. Using the reflective bumps between the white dashed lines can be a helpful tool when placing cones in the road. If you're going to use them as a reference marker, it's best to use your stride to walk out the distance between a set of reflective bumps to make sure that they're placed properly. This is a helpful tip because they should be the same spacing footage-wise apart as the speed of the road. In this section, we'll teach you how to set up the perfect cone taper every time, even on curved roads. We'll start off with the straight road, and then we'll show you how it works with a curved road. Start by placing one cone at the shoulder of the road to start your taper. Using the stride technique we talked about earlier, walk backwards so that you can watch oncoming traffic as you get to where the second cone will need to be. Place one cone at the shoulder of the road, then place another cone next to it. Then remove the cone closest to the shoulder of the road. Repeat the same sequence again, but this time place 3 cones next to each other and remove the 2 cones closest to the shoulder of the road. If you walked your strides accurately, you'll have a perfect cone taper for the speed of the road. You always want to try to avoid setting up a taper in a curve. You may even want to extend the work site by creating a taper before the curve. But if you have no other choice, there are a few things that you should know. You can't site a cone taper in a curve, and it'll usually end up like this. If you were to place cones in the road like this, you'll raise the chances of creating a traffic accident because the taper will not be the correct length for the speed of the road. But if you were to use the same technique we just talked about, you will create a perfect cone taper every time. Notice the pattern as we set this up. The first cone is one cone. The second cone in the taper is the second cone from the shoulder of the road. The third cone is the third cone from the shoulder of the road. And the fourth cone is the fourth cone from the edge of the road. As you become more comfortable with this technique, you may be able to use one cone and count from the edge of the road the correct cone position. An aero board's not just a trailer. Sure, you have to inspect and hook up an aero board like any other trailer, but it poses its own unique challenges because it's short and top-heavy. We've all heard stories about different accidents involving aero boards, so always work and drive cautiously with an aero board because serious injury and death can occur not only to you and your partner, but to pedestrians and motorists as well. For the safety of yourself and others, if you're the driver of an aero board, you are responsible for making sure that it is in proper working order. So you always want to inspect the aero board and notify management of any issues that may need to be fixed before you leave the yard. And once you get out to the work site, you'll want to set it up properly. Here's a picture of a good hook. It is not misshapen or chewed up from being drug on the ground, and it has a functioning safety latch. Let's show you a couple of examples of hooks that need to be brought to the attention of your manager. This hook is missing a safety latch and the hook is misshapen. This hook does not have a functioning safety latch. Here's an example of chains that are in good condition. The links in this chain are misshapen and have been ground down from being drug on the ground. The chains are only supposed to be crossed once and not wound together like in this picture. The electrical cable needs to be run so that it will not be tangled up in the chains. The electrical harness and plug should be free from damage. In this picture, there is a missing pin in the harness which will not allow the lights to function properly. In this picture, the harness has been drug on the ground, exposing the electrical wire under the insulation. This can cause corrosion to build up in the wire, which will cause an electrical failure. When inspecting the pins, you want to make sure that they are in proper shape. Ground down and misshapen pins may not make proper contact, causing an electrical failure. Inspect your brake lights and turn signals before leaving the yard. Make sure that the light housings are intact. In this picture, the red lens cover is missing. This bulb glows clear. Without the red lens cover over it, it is not a legal running light, brake light, or turn signal. Not to mention, if the bulb were to get wet, it could cause an electrical failure. You want to make sure that you're using a proper safety pin. A bolt, piece of wire, or whatever else you might find is not an acceptable substitute for a safety pin. The safety pin should always be attached to the trailer so that it cannot get lost. And a properly working latch will slide well past the end of the safety pin when it is in position. In this section, we'll go over the company standards for the basic order in which to set up an aero board. Just note, additional precautions may be necessary if you find yourself working on uneven ground. Disconnect the aero board from the truck. Make sure to disconnect the chains last in case the aero board wants to roll away on you. Jockey the board into position. For the most part, the aero board is placed with the truck, but minor adjustments may need to be made. Next, you'll want to put down the wheel chock. In some cases, you'll want to put the wheel chock down before you even disconnect the aero board from the truck, because on steep hills, the aero board will want to roll away. Raise the panel and select the appropriate pattern. The reason it is raised at this point is because with the panel down, it is better balanced if the aero board needs to be moved in the prior step. Sight the aero board. You'll use the jack to raise and lower the aero board while using the aero board sight, which could either be a tube or a series of eye bolts. You want to aim the aero board at the driver's side of the windshield of approaching traffic in the lane that you are closing down at the furthest point possible. Lower and secure the legs. Once the aero board is sighted, start with the legs that are on the downhill side of the road. Remove the pin, lower the legs, and place the pin back in, and put the latch back around the pin to make sure that it stays in place. You may need to use the jack to raise or lower the aero board to get the pin to fit. You also want to double check to see if the aero board is still sighted properly. Then lower and lock the second set of legs into place. By having the forelegs down and locked, if a vehicle were to strike the aero board or a strong gust of wind were to come up, the aero board would be more stable and not just flop over or roll around. Thank you for taking your time learning about a few essential skills for traffic control. Now it's time to take a test on what you just learned.